The morning sun carved harsh shadows across the New Mexico Badlands when Jake Morrison first heard the screaming. It came from beyond the ridge, faint but unmistakable, carried on the desert wind like a prayer torn from someone's throat. He had been checking fence lines on his remote cattle ranch, a daily ritual that kept his hands busy and his mind from wandering too far into the dark corners of memory. The screaming stopped abruptly, replaced by the crack of rifle fire that echoed off canyon walls like thunder before a storm. Jake's weathered hands tightened on his horse's reins as he urged the mare up the rocky slope. At 42, he had learned to read the language of violence in the wilderness. Single shots meant hunting, multiple shots meant trouble, and the screaming that preceded them meant something far worse than either. His ranch sat on the edge of Apache territory, a boundary that existed more in the minds of mapmakers than in the harsh reality of desert life. Out here, survival mattered more than the color of a man's skin or the language he spoke to his gods. The ridge revealed a scene that made Jake's blood run cold. Below, in a shallow valley, a small Apache camp was under attack. 6 men on horseback circled the cluster of hide tents like wolves around wounded prey, their rifles spitting fire and death. Women and children scattered like startled birds, some falling before they could find cover behind rocks and scrub brush. The attackers wore no uniforms, carried no flags, just the hard faces of men who had decided that killing was easier than living alongside those who were different. Jake recognized the leader immediately. Hank Rawlings, a failed rancher turned outlaw who blamed everyone but himself for his misfortunes. Rawlings had been recruiting men like him, feeding their anger and desperation with promises of easy money and the satisfaction of striking back at a world that had passed them by. The Apache camp appeared to be mostly women, children, and elderly men, their warriors likely away hunting or trading in distant settlements. Without hesitation, Jake spurred his horse down the slope. His rifle came up smooth and natural, the first shot taking Rawlings' lieutenant from his saddle before the man knew death was coming. The second shot scattered the horses, causing chaos in the attackers' ranks. Jake's war cry echoed across the valley, a sound that seemed to come from some primal place deep in his chest. He had been a soldier once, had seen what happened when good men stood by and watched evil unfold. The fight was brief but vicious. Jake's unexpected arrival had shifted the balance, giving the Apache defenders time to organize their own response. An old man emerged from behind a boulder with a Spencer rifle, his shots precise and deadly. A young woman appeared at the edge of the camp, bow in hand, her arrows finding their marks with silent efficiency. The outlaws, faced with organized resistance instead of helpless victims, began to falter. Rawlings himself wheeled his horse around, his face twisted with rage and disbelief. "You're defending savages, Morrison!" he screamed across the gunfire. "When they come for your cattle, don't expect help from decent folk." Jake's response was another rifle shot that knocked Rawlings' hat from his head. The outlaw leader cursed and spurred his horse toward the ridge, his remaining men following in scattered retreat. But Jake knew they would be back, probably with more men and a deeper thirst for vengeance. He had made enemies today, but he had also made a choice he could live with. The silence that followed the gunfire was broken only by the whimpering of wounded horses and the low moans of the injured. Jake dismounted slowly, his rifle still ready, and walked toward the camp. The Apache defenders watched him approach, their faces guarded but not hostile. They had seen him fight beside them, had witnessed his choice to stand against his own kind for the sake of justice. An elderly Apache man stepped forward, his bearing dignified despite the chaos around him. His hair was white as winter snow, his face lined with the wisdom of many seasons. He wore traditional clothing mixed with pieces of white man's clothing, a living symbol of the complex world they all inhabited. When he spoke, his English was clear and measured, touched with the accent of his native tongue. "I am White Bear," he said, his dark eyes studying Jake's face. "You risked your life for people you do not know. This is the way of warriors, not the way of most white men who come to our land." Jake lowered his rifle completely, a gesture of respect. "Name's Jake Morrison. I've got a spread about 5 miles north. I heard the shooting." He paused, looking around at the destruction. "I've seen enough killing to know when it's wrong." White Bear nodded slowly. "You have honor, Jake Morrison, but those men will return. They will bring others. This I know." As if to emphasize his words, a young Apache woman emerged from behind one of the damaged tents. She moved with the fluid grace of someone raised in the wilderness, but Jake could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her eyes constantly scanned for threats. She was beautiful in the way that desert flowers are beautiful, hardy and resilient, adapted to harsh conditions, but no less striking for their toughness. She spoke rapidly in Apache to White Bear, her voice urgent. The old man listened, then turned back to Jake. "My granddaughter Ayana says the men spoke of bringing the cavalry. They claim we have stolen cattle, attacked settlers. These are lies, but lies with badges carry weight." Jake felt a familiar tightness in his chest. He had dealt with cavalry officers who saw Apache as less than human, who treated Indian wars as opportunities for promotion rather than complex conflicts requiring understanding. "How many people do you have here?" 43, White Bear replied. "Mostly women and children. Our warriors hunt in the mountains, 2 days' ride. We are peaceful people, Jake Morrison. We trade with some settlers, avoid trouble, but there are those who would see us all dead or driven away." Jake looked around the camp again, noting the practical way it was organized, the evidence of craftsmanship in the tools and weapons, the obvious care taken with the children. These were not the savage raiders of newspaper stories and political speeches. These were people trying to live with dignity in a world that seemed determined to destroy them. "You need to move," Jake said finally. "Tonight. I know a place, a hidden valley about 15 miles east. Water, grass, defensible. You could stay there while we figure out what to do next." White Bear raised an eyebrow. "We?" Jake surprised himself with his answer. "I'm not walking away from this. Those men made it personal when they started killing women and children. I've got supplies, ammunition, horses, and I know the country better than any cavalry patrol." Ayana stepped closer, her eyes meeting Jake's for the first time. When she spoke, her English was accented but clear. "You would leave your home to help us. Why?" The question hung in the air between them like desert heat. Jake found himself looking into eyes that had seen too much violence, too much loss, but still held a spark of hope. "Because it's the right thing to do," he said simply. "Because I've been running from who I am for too long." The preparation for departure began immediately. Jake rode back to his ranch to gather supplies, while the Apache packed their essential belongings. The hidden valley he had mentioned was real, a place he had discovered during his early years in the territory. It was accessible only through a narrow canyon that could be easily defended, with a spring that never ran dry and grass enough for horses and cattle. As the sun began to set, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson, the small caravan set out across the Badlands. Jake rode point, his eyes constantly scanning for signs of pursuit. Behind him, the Apache moved with the practiced silence of people who had learned that survival often depended on invisibility. Children rode double with adults, their faces solemn but trusting. The elderly were helped by the young, no one left behind despite the danger. Ayana rode near the front of the group, her horse a paint mare that seemed to respond to her thoughts rather than her commands. She had changed from her torn dress into traditional Apache riding clothes, and Jake found himself stealing glances at her profile against the darkening sky. There was something about her that drew his attention beyond her obvious beauty, a strength that seemed to radiate from within. "You were a soldier," she said suddenly, her voice carrying clearly in the still air. Jake nodded, surprised by her observation. "How did you know?" "The way you fought, the way you move. My people have fought soldiers for many years. We learned to recognize warriors." She paused, studying his face. "But you are different. You chose to fight for us, not against us." "I chose to fight for what's right," Jake replied. "The uniform doesn't make the man." They rode in comfortable silence after that. the desert around them alive with the sounds of night creatures emerging from their daytime hiding places. Coyotes called from distant ridges, their voices weaving together in an ancient song. Somewhere in the darkness, an owl questioned the night, its call echoing off canyon walls. The hidden valley proved to be everything Jake had promised. The narrow entrance opened into a circular basin, perhaps 2 miles across, with high walls on all sides that would make it nearly impossible to attack without warning. The spring bubbled up from rocks at the center, feeding a small stream that wandered through rich grass before disappearing into an underground channel at the far end. As the Apache set up their temporary camp, Jake found himself working alongside them, helping to gather firewood and tend to the horses. The cultural barriers that seemed so important to the outside world meant nothing here in the face of practical necessity. Children who had been terrified hours earlier now played quietly near the stream, their laughter a healing sound in the desert night. White Bear approached Jake as he finished hobbling his horse. "You have given us a gift, Jake Morrison, a chance to live another day. But I must ask, what do you want in return?" Jake looked around the valley, at the faces illuminated by firelight, at the simple humanity of people taking care of each other. "I want to belong somewhere," he said finally. "I want to be part of something that matters." The old man nodded, as if he had expected this answer. "Belonging is not given, it is earned. But you have made a good start." That night, as Jake lay in his bedroll beneath a canopy of stars, he heard the sound that would change his life forever. It started as a low humming, barely audible above the whisper of wind through rock. Then it grew, became a rhythm, became a song. The Apache were drumming, their voices joining in a chant that seemed to come from the earth itself. Jake rose and walked to the edge of the firelight, where he could see the ceremony taking place. The men who had remained in camp sat in a circle around a small drum, their voices rising and falling in harmony. White Bear noticed him watching and beckoned him closer. "This is a song of gratitude," the old man explained. "A song for warriors who risk their lives for others. Tonight, we sing for you." Jake felt something break open in his chest, a dam that had been holding back years of loneliness and regret. He had been a soldier, a rancher, a man trying to build a life in an unforgiving land. But he had never been a hero to anyone, never been celebrated or honored for his choices. The sound of the drums echoed off the valley walls, creating a rhythm that seemed to pulse with the heartbeat of the earth itself. Ayana appeared beside him, her presence soft and warm in the cool desert night. "They are singing about you," she said quietly. "About the man who rode down from the ridge when death was coming, about the warrior who chose justice over safety." Jake turned to look at her, seeing his own reflection in her dark eyes. "I'm not a hero," he said. "I just did what needed doing." "That is what heroes do," she replied. "They do what needs doing when others will not." The days that followed fell into a pattern of watchful waiting. Jake rode out each morning to scout the surrounding country, looking for signs of pursuit. The Apache went about the business of living, the women working on traditional crafts, while the men hunted small game and maintained their weapons. Children played and learned, their laughter echoing off the valley walls. Jake found himself drawn into their daily life in ways he hadn't expected. He helped repair equipment, shared knowledge about the local wildlife, and slowly began to learn words in their language. The barriers between them weren't disappearing, but they were becoming more permeable, less important than the shared humanity that connected them all. Ayana became his teacher in many ways, showing him how to read signs in the desert that he had never noticed before. She taught him to identify edible plants, to predict weather changes from the behavior of animals, to move through the landscape with the silent efficiency of someone born to it. In return, he shared his knowledge of ranching, of white man's ways, of the political forces that shaped their world. "Why did you never marry?" she asked one evening as they sat by the stream, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. Jake considered the question carefully. "I was married once, long time ago, before I came west. She died of fever while I was away fighting in the war. When I came home, there was nothing left but graves and memories." Ayana nodded, understanding the weight of loss in his voice. "I was to be married also, a young warrior from a neighboring band, but the soldiers came and he was killed defending children who were not even his own. Sometimes I think the spirits bring us together not in spite of our losses, but because of them." Their hands found each other in the darkness, fingers intertwining like the streams that join to form rivers. Jake felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the desert climate, a sense of connection that went deeper than words or cultural differences. It was on the 7th day that Jake's morning scout brought troubling news. Smoke rose from the direction of his ranch, too much smoke to be a controlled fire. He rode hard toward home, his heart heavy with the certainty of what he would find. The buildings were ash and ember, still smoking in the morning heat. His cattle were gone, either stolen or scattered. In the dirt near what had been his front porch, boot prints and horse tracks told the story of vengeful men who had taken their anger out on an empty house. A crude sign was nailed to the remains of his fence. "Indian lover, next time you'll burn too." Jake sat on his horse for a long time, looking at the destruction of everything he had built. The practical loss was significant, but the emotional impact was somehow less than he had expected. The ranch had been a place to hide from the world, a way to avoid choosing sides in the conflicts that shaped the territory. Now that choice had been made for him, and he found himself strangely at peace with the result. When he returned to the hidden valley, Ayana took one look at his face and knew what had happened. "They burned it," she said, not asking. "Yes," Jake replied. "Everything." White Bear emerged from his tent, his weathered face grave. "I'm sorry, Jake Morrison. This is our fault. We have brought trouble to your life." Jake shook his head. "No, grandfather, this is their fault. The men who choose hate over understanding, who think violence solves problems. I made my choice with my eyes open." "What will you do now?" Ayana asked. Jake looked around the valley at the people who had become his responsibility and his family. "I reckon I'll stay here as long as you'll have me. A man needs to belong somewhere, and this feels more like home than any place I've known." That night, the drums spoke again. But this time, Jake understood their message differently. They were not just honoring a warrior or celebrating a victory. They were welcoming him into something larger than himself, something that transcended the boundaries of race and culture and nationality. They were making him part of the tribe. The ceremony was simple but profound. White Bear spoke words in Apache that Jake didn't understand, but their meaning was clear in the faces around the fire. Ayana translated softly, her voice carrying the weight of ancient ritual. "He says, you are no longer a stranger among us. You are brother, protector, family. He says the spirits have guided your path to this place, and we are all stronger for your presence." Jake felt tears on his cheeks, the first he had shed since his wife's death years earlier. The sound of the drums seemed to vibrate in his bones, connecting him to something primal and eternal. Around the fire, men and women who had been enemies of his people, according to the newspapers and politicians, now looked at him with acceptance and respect. When the ceremony ended, Jake found himself walking with Ayana toward the stream. The night air was cool and sweet, filled with the scent of sage and the sound of water moving over stone. She moved close to him, her presence warming him more than any fire. "Are you afraid?" she asked quietly. "Of what?" "Of choosing us over your own people, of living as an outlaw in your own land." Jake considered this seriously. "I'm afraid of living without purpose. I'm afraid of being alone. But I'm not afraid of the choice I've made." She turned to face him, her eyes reflecting starlight. "Good, because I am falling in love with you, Jake Morrison, and love requires courage." Their kiss was soft and tentative at first, then deeper as they discovered in each other something that had been missing from their lives. She tasted of wild honey and desert wind, of strength and vulnerability combined. He held her carefully, as if she might disappear like a desert mirage, but she pressed closer, solid and real and alive in his arms. "I love you too," he whispered against her hair. "I think I have since the first moment I saw you." They stood together by the stream, two people from different worlds who had found in each other something that transcended all the hatred and fear that divided their peoples. Around them, the desert night pulsed with life, and somewhere in the distance, a nightbird called out a song that sounded like hope. The wedding, when it came 3 weeks later, was a blend of traditions that would have shocked the civilized world. White Bear performed the Apache ceremony, binding their hands with braided sweetgrass while speaking blessings in words that reached back to the beginning of time. Jake spoke his vows in English, then repeated them haltingly in Apache, his pronunciation bringing gentle laughter from the gathered people. Ayana wore a dress of white doeskin decorated with beadwork that told the story of her family line. Jake wore his best shirt and pants, but around his neck hung a necklace of turquoise and silver that White Bear had given him, a symbol of his acceptance into the tribe. They exchanged rings made from silver dollars, hammered flat by the camp's metalworker and inscribed with symbols that represented their journey together. The celebration lasted 3 days, with feasting and dancing and the constant presence of the drums. Jake learned traditional Apache dances, his movements awkward at first, but growing more confident as he let the rhythm guide him. He shared stories of his life, his battles, his long journey to this moment. The Apache shared their own stories, their history, their hopes for the future. On the 3rd night, as the celebration wound down and couples drifted away to their own private celebrations, Jake and Ayana walked to the far end of the valley. There, beneath a natural overhang in the rock wall, they had built a small shelter that would serve as their home. It was simple but sturdy, with a stone fireplace and windows that looked out over the stream. "Are you happy?" Ayana asked, as they stood in the doorway of their new home. Jake pulled her close, breathing in the scent of her hair. "Happier than I ever thought possible. You've given me a life I never knew I wanted." "We have given each other life," she corrected. "Before you, I was existing, surviving. Now I am living." They made love that night with the tenderness of two people who had found in each other something precious and fragile. The sound of the stream provided a gentle soundtrack to their union, and through the window, stars wheeled overhead in their eternal dance. Jake had never felt more connected to another human being, more aware of the simple miracle of being alive and in love. As summer gave way to autumn, their life in the hidden valley took on the rhythms of a small, close-knit community. Jake's knowledge of ranching proved invaluable as they worked to build a more permanent settlement. He helped design corrals for the horses, irrigation systems for small gardens, and defensive positions that would protect them if they were ever discovered by hostile forces. Ayana was pregnant by the first snow, her belly growing round beneath her winter clothes. Jake watched her with a mixture of wonder and protective anxiety, amazed by the changes in her body and the life growing within her. She seemed to glow with inner light, her beauty enhanced by the promise of new life. "What will we name our child?" she asked one evening as they sat by their fire, her hand resting on her swollen belly. Jake placed his hand over hers, feeling the baby move beneath their joined palms. "If it's a boy, I'd like to name him for White Bear. He's the one who taught me what family really means." Ayana smiled. "And if it's a girl?" "Hope," Jake said without hesitation, "because that's what she'll represent. Hope for a future where children can grow up without fear, where love matters more than the color of skin or the language of prayer." Winter in the hidden valley was harsh but beautiful. Snow covered the high walls, creating a world of white silence that seemed to exist outside of time. The Apache had ways of surviving the cold that Jake had never imagined, techniques passed down through generations of living in harmony with the land. He learned to read weather signs in the behavior of animals, to predict storms by the way smoke rose from their fires. He helped hunt the winter game that sustained them, his rifle combining with traditional Apache hunting methods to provide meat for the community. He told stories by the fire, sharing tales of his life before the desert, his adventures as a soldier and rancher. In return, the Apache shared their own stories, legends, and histories that went back thousands of years. Jake learned about the spiritual beliefs that connected his new people to the land, about the complex social structures that governed their lives, about the long struggle to maintain their culture in the face of overwhelming pressure to assimilate or disappear. "Your people fear us because they do not understand us," White Bear explained one night as they sat around the central fire. "They see only the war paint and the weapons, not the children playing or the grandmothers teaching. They hear only the war cries, not the lullabies." Jake nodded, understanding the truth of this in a way he couldn't have before living among them. Fear makes people do terrible things. It makes them see enemies where they might have found friends. But you overcame your fear," Ayanna said, her hand finding his in the firelight. "You chose to see us as human beings, not as the savage Indians of the stories." "I chose to see you as people worth fighting for," Jake replied. The rest came naturally. Spring brought new challenges and new hope. Ayanna's pregnancy was progressing normally, but Jake worried about the lack of medical care in their isolated valley. He had learned traditional Apache birthing practices from the older women, but the thought of something going wrong terrified him. "Women have been having babies for thousands of years," Ayanna reminded him gently. "My grandmother delivered over 100 children, and she will deliver ours. Trust in the wisdom of our people." Jake did trust, but he also prepared. He rode out of the valley for the first time in months, making his way to a distant settlement where he could trade for medical supplies and gather news of the outside world. What he learned there chilled him to the bone. The territorial government had put a price on his head, branding him as an outlaw and Indian sympathizer. Rawlings had spread stories about the attack on the Apache camp, painting himself as a hero defending civilization against savage attackers. Jake was wanted for treason, for murder, for a dozen crimes he had never committed. But there was also hope in the news he gathered. The federal government was beginning to change its policies toward the Apache, recognizing that endless war was costly and ineffective. There were rumors of peace negotiations, of reservations that would allow the Apache to maintain some of their traditional ways while living under government protection. Jake returned to the valley with supplies and information, sharing both the good news and the bad with White Bear and the other leaders. They listened gravely, weighing the implications of each development. "If there is to be peace," White Bear said finally, "it must be a peace that honors both peoples. We cannot simply surrender our ways to avoid conflict." "And I can't go back to the life I had before," Jake added. "Win or lose, I'm staying with you." The baby came with the spring flowers, a daughter born during a thunderstorm that seemed to announce her arrival to the world. Jake held his child for the first time as rain drummed on the roof of their shelter, her tiny fingers gripping his thumb with surprising strength. "She looks like you," Ayanna said softly, exhausted but glowing with joy. Jake studied his daughter's face, seeing Ayanna's strong features softened by youth and innocence. "She's beautiful. Perfect." They named her Hope, as they had planned. But White Bear also gave her an Apache name, Aylin, meaning joy-bringer. The ceremony that welcomed her into the tribe was one of the most moving experiences of Jake's life, as the community gathered to bless the child who represented their future. As Hope grew, Jake found himself thinking more about the legacy he wanted to leave her. The Hidden Valley was safe for now, but it was also isolated, cut off from the larger world. He wanted his daughter to have choices, to be able to move between the Apache world and the white world, if she chose to do so. "She will be a bridge," Ayanna said, as they watched Hope take her first steps near the stream. "She will carry the best of both worlds within her." Jake hoped this was true, but he also knew that the world outside their valley was not ready for bridges. The hatred and fear that had driven him to this place still poisoned the hearts of too many people. Change would come slowly, if at all. But in the hidden valley, change was already happening. The Apache were learning new ways of living, adapting to the reality of white settlement while maintaining their core values. Jake was learning that belonging had nothing to do with blood or birth, everything to do with choice and commitment. As the seasons turned and hope grew into a bright, curious toddler, Jake found himself thinking less about the past and more about the future. The drums still echoed in the valley at night, but now they spoke of continuity rather than crisis, of a people who had found a way to survive and thrive despite overwhelming odds. One evening, as the sun set over the valley walls and painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Jake sat by the stream with Ayana and Hope. Their daughter splashed in the shallow water, her laughter mixing with the sound of the current over stone. "Do you ever regret it?" Ayana asked quietly. "Giving up your old life for this?" Jake considered the question seriously, looking around at the valley that had become his world. "I regret the time I wasted before I found you. I regret the years I spent alone, thinking that isolation was safety. But I don't regret a single moment since I rode down that ridge and chose to fight beside your people." Ayana smiled, her hand finding his as it had that first night by the fire. "The drums still speak of you, you know. They call you the man who chose love over fear, who proved that enemies can become family." Jake listened to the evening sounds of the valley, the voices of children playing, the gentle conversation of adults sharing the day's experiences. Somewhere in the distance, he could hear the first faint rhythm of the evening drums, beginning the nightly celebration of life and community. "I can hear them," he said softly, "and I understand what they're saying now. They're saying that home isn't a place, it's the people who welcome you. They're saying that family isn't blood, it's choice. They're saying that love is the only thing that really matters in the end." As darkness fell over the hidden valley, the drums grew louder, their rhythm joining with the heartbeat of the earth itself. Jake held his wife and daughter close, surrounded by the community that had become his family, and knew that he had found something worth fighting for, worth dying for, worth living for. The drums echoed through the night, carrying their message of hope and unity to the stars above. And in that sound, Jake heard the promise of a future where children like Hope could grow up in a world where love had finally conquered fear, where the color of skin mattered less than the content of character, where the drums of peace could drown out the thunder of war. The desert wind carried the sound across the Badlands, over the mountains, into the dreams of people who had forgotten what it meant to live without hatred. And somewhere in that music, the voice of a better world was calling, waiting for enough people to listen and choose love over fear, hope over despair, unity over division. The drums echoed in his honor, and Jake Morrison knew that he had finally found his place in the world.